And you are live.
Okay, welcome to House Education, Tuesday, February 4th, 2025. To our legions of subscribers, we're in a new environment and using new technology. For those of you who are watching us on YouTube or joining us live via Zoom. All right, so today we are going to take another look at H129. This is the result of the work of the task force from this past off-season, looking at school construction aid. So my feeling, and folks may differ on this, is that if we're going to talk about fewer districts, big changes, we really can't talk about it without talking about school construction needs and having some sort of program that says, okay, you know, if we want schools of a certain size and all of that, that's going to require some construction. And I don't think anybody feels like construction is a real possibility in Vermont right now without a state aid, especially when it comes to major capital investments and expansions. So we're going to try to do the best we can, taking a deep dive into this. I think this is also, I suspect they would agree, a very important piece that is missing from the governor's proposal, is from everything we have seen. So I think it is going to be incumbent on us to do what we can. So we're going to take another walk through 129. But with that, we'll turn it over to Legislative Council to do that.
Sounds good. Afternoon, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Council. I'm happy to start screen sharing and jump directly into the document, but it may be helpful just for me to orient by talking about what the current school construction program does, if you guys want that. Obviously, it's been under a moratorium. But
yeah, I may just stop you there and say, do people want a recap of the current program that doesn't really exist? And which, or not? Have you heard enough in the past?
I just didn't know. I just have a quick question. So, and maybe he's going to answer this question. So, do you envision a program that's similar to the one that is now not being used, or something?
I think we could describe it as something significantly different.
Okay.
Yeah.
But actually, quite a few of the features
Pulls in.
may exist.
All right.
And
Yep.
what's
All right,
there
why
on
don't you
the
go ahead and
shelf
give us a
unused.
brief
Yep.
overview of what we have.
for sure. So the way that this currently works, we're talking about Title 16, Chapter 123. The treasurer is authorized to bond to aid school construction projects. So this relies on state bonding capacity. That's one of the key features of our current system. And one of the effects that that has had is that as maintenance has accrued over the years, the state has found itself in a position where it can't fund those obligations. So reliance on the state bonding capacity has a dramatic effect on the current system and the moratorium that's been arrived at. So treasurer authorizes to issue bonds to assist school districts for their school construction projects, relies on a two-step application process that has two different parties approving different parts of that application. So you have the Secretary of Education authorizing particular pieces, and you also have the state board authorizing particular pieces of the current school construction aid program. So you have divided responsibilities between education and the state board. Task the State Board of Education with prioritizing projects and continually making requests to the relevant institutions committee, so House Corrections and Institutions and Senate institutions. So when this was in operation, this was going through the capital build process for school construction aid. The current program awards aid as a percentage of eligible construction costs based on particular kinds of project types. And this is important to think about. You can have policy levers to prioritize particular kinds of projects, and particularly given the intro that was just described, if there's a focus on consolidation that might happen across moving to a 5-district model, you could include language to prioritize particular kinds of projects that facilitate that vision of education. The Secretary of Education is authorized to grant aid to emergency projects. These are kind of siphoned off separately from the rest of the application process for general school construction aid. And it's important to note that although there has been a moratorium in place since 2007, that emergency aid piece has persisted. So that's still ongoing. And then rulemaking authority under the current school construction program is granted to the State Board of Education. So again, just drawing out divided responsibilities. With that, I will jump to see if I can screen share. I am wildly disturbed at how different the Zoom looks, but I
Yeah.
this.
And should we note every time something is a first, so you're the first person to screen share in our community.
Well, everyone's gonna have the incentive to screen share immediately because you feel like
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yes, this is great.
face betrays so much of how I feel. Okay, H 129, we're talking about school construction. So we had talked about this diverging quite substantially from the existing program on the book. The one thing I would note is that as currently set up, and I should say that this is a start. This is a shell. It does include pretty substantial pieces, but this is just a starting point. The working group this past year did not get to a place of a fulsome recommendation, I would say, that fills out a full program. But this is expected once decisions have been made to slot into the current place where the existing program is and would repeal those pieces. So this is meant to replace those provisions. And some of the language, which I'll talk about once we get to it, will look similar to existing application processes, but there are also substantial new pieces. So first, we have this proposed section 3440, statement of policy. This is kind of like an intent statement. I can read these pieces. So the intent is to encourage efficient use of public funds to modernize school infrastructure in alignment with current educational needs. These projects should be developed taking consideration of education quality standards under section 165 and prioritizing cost, geographic accessibility, 21st century education facility standards, enrollment trends, and capacity and scale that support best educational practices. I want to pause here and call out that these particular provisions, the prioritizing cost, geographic accessibility, 21st century education facility standards, enrollment trends, and capacity and scale were fairly deliberate parts of the working group process. And just to call out why this section even matters, this piece is pulled into how the chapter as a whole is meant to be read. And as you will see as we walk through, significant elements of the development of the program have been assigned to the Agency of Education, where this program is meant to be housed or is envisioned as being housed. And so the Agency of Education would be left through rulemaking to fill out particularly meaningful pieces of the program, including things like how to prioritize particular projects, how to assign additional aid to particular projects. So kind of key policy levers in the current draft are assigned to the Agency of Education to develop. And so part of why this section really matters is this is the guidance that constrains that extension, that delegation of authority to the Agency of Education. So this is also a nice place to think about the impact that you guys can have as legislators. Like, this is such a powerful section for expressing your intent behind the program, and particularly given if you decide to accept this approach of delegating these pieces to the Agency of Education. This is a place where you can cabin that authority and make clear what direction the Agency of Education is meant to follow. So that's why we're starting with this policy section. Further, it is the intent of this chapter to encourage the use of existing infrastructure to meet needs and joint construction projects between two or more school districts and consolidation of buildings within a district where feasible and educationally appropriate are encouraged. So expressing some pretty clear intent here as to a particular kind of educational vision, but it's worth saying that you could modify these pieces and draw out a particular kind of educational vision as you see fit. So that's section 1. Section 2 is setting up essentially the creation of the program and its housing. So the Agency of Education shall be responsible for implementing the state aid for school construction program according to the provisions of this chapter. And then it lists a set of responsibilities. So this is setting up the program within AOE and then spelling out what the particular responsibilities are. I'll walk through these, but just to talk about the genesis of these responsibilities, these were largely assembled from the existing responsibilities that the State Board of Education and the Agency of Education currently bear under the non-functional program. Additionally, a few pieces were brought in from Rhode Island. I will admit that my knowledge of the Rhode Island program is probably less than you guys have. And I expect that that will be a topic of conversation, and I'm happy to get up to speed on that piece. But just to say that the list of responsibilities here were compiled from existing responsibilities divided between AOE and the state board, plus a couple of provisions brought in from Rhode Island. So what is AOE tasked with? Sub 1, reviewing all preliminary applications for aid and approving or denying those. 2, adopting rules pertaining to school construction and capital outlay, including rules to specify a point prioritization methodology and a bonus incentive structure aligned with the legislative intent expressed in the section that we just walked through. So just to call it again, it's part of why that policy section is so important. This is brought into and is meant to cabin that rulemaking authority that's extended to the AOE. But this is a fairly broad grant. This is the grant to authorize rulemaking related to this school construction program. And what's been drawn out here is to particularly say they need to develop this prioritization program and they need to develop a bonus incentive structure. We're going to have to develop a bunch of other things, but this was just called out as particularly important policy levers. And you can use that statement of policy to cabin that development.
So just to emphasize to everybody, so that section 3440 is going to be really important for us to look at, modify, and create in a way that sort of suits our vision.
Exactly. And I think it's nice too, in that it's such an easy thing for legislators to talk about too. Sometimes we talk about mechanical provisions where we have to really get into the details. This is about the vision that you guys have for how this program should be shaped and what AOE should listen to as they develop rules.
Can I just, I'm sorry, do you mind if I ask just very quick? Currently, or in the previous program, I don't want to talk about the current program, rules were done there too.
Yes, but they were handled by the State Board of Education.
Got it.
It's a big difference.
That is a big difference. Okay. Thank you.
Third, and this one's a pretty significant responsibility as well, including as part of its budget submitted to the governor, its annual school construction funding request. So this tasks AOE with each year going to the governor before the governor makes the annual budget request to come up with a school construction funding request. So that would be incorporated into that budget request. So this wouldn't be coming after the budget has come out. It's meant to be part of that deliberative process about aggregate dollars across the state as a whole. And in part, I think, the group was hoping that that would ensure this isn't an afterthought, that that's part of like primary discussions as to how state funding are going to happen. Fourth, we're going to talk about some sort of, I would call them less interesting. These are more functional pieces. Developing a pre-qualification and review process for project delivery consultants and certain specialized firms. So this is essentially having a list of the appropriate parties to help with this program. Division 5, providing technical assistance and guidance to school districts and supervisory unions on all phases of school capital projects. I think about this technical assistance as being about getting through the school construction aid process. So this is, people are going to need hands-on work with how to navigate this particular process. And the next, what you see in subdivision 6 is providing assistance, training, and education to districts, supervisory unions, general contractors, subcontractors, managers, designers, other vendors in the planning, maintenance, and establishment of school facility space. So you can think of the first of these in subdivision 5 as being about navigating the aid process. There may be other pieces to that as well. And the next is about navigating the actual construction, planning, how to think about space. So some functional provisions. Subdivision 7, maintaining a current list of school construction projects that have received preliminary approval, projects that have received final approval. So we're still sticking with that two-step application process that's envisioned in current law, and the priority points awarded to each project. So this is just keeping track of the projects, because this is going to determine where funding can actually go. Those prioritization points are going to let us know when dollars can first be made available to a particular project. So this is just ensuring that there's an accurate aggregate picture of ongoing projects in the state. 8, collecting, maintaining, and making publicly available quarterly progress reports of all ongoing school construction projects, including costs and the time schedule. 9th, recommending policies and procedures designed to reduce borrowing for school construction programs. 10th, conducting a needs survey at least every 5 years. And I wanted to say quinquennially, which is apparently the word for every 5 years, but I didn't know what that was, and I don't know if anyone was gonna know what that was. So conducting a needs survey at least every 5 years. Um,
I'm gonna interrupt for a second, just to ask you, as I look at this, I think to myself, okay, so number 5, providing technical assistance and guidance to school districts. It's fairly vague. Would it be your recommendation that we should probably go into a lot more detail, or it would be your advice to not go into a lot more detail?
I
And I know
think,
it depends.
sure. So I would say, I sat down and looked at this before. I walked in here to make sure that I was up to speed on all the pieces. And on my first glance, I think if you're looking at this quickly, it's easy to confuse 5 and 6. And the way that I was able to interpret 5 is by looking at it in juxtaposition with 6 and thinking, well, we know more definitively what 6 is because it's spelled out in greater detail. And so therefore I can kind of like back into what 5 might mean. I do think you could ask the question, do we know what 5 means? And greater clarity would enhance that. So I take the point that you could enhance this. I think in part it will be helpful to think about the total set of responsibilities together as like a set of duties that the agency is meant to handle. And also to get a sense from what the agency feels about these pieces. And sometimes we get into areas where we hear that a particular department knows what the language means because they function in a particular way, but then they're also able to diverge from legislative intention because they know that what they're doing fits under the broad language. So I would say if the group wants to ensure sufficient legislative direction in these spaces, I think that, yeah, wordsmithing and adding in detail could help. And I think you can see it how I got my interpretation of 5 and also being part of the initial process to see this. But I agree. In some of these pieces, I think that you could enhance details. And part of what you see here is exactly the assembly process, like drawn from here, drawn from there. We've got the items here that the group felt were appropriate to think about, but now you can work them out together and think about refining them. And you may want to add particular pieces too, but I think that this is, and obviously we have reps on the committee who can speak to this, but I think this was built out as a pretty expansive set of responsibilities that I didn't hear an appetite from the group to say, we expect to add a lot more responsibilities to this list, although you could come to that.
It's more detail that I'm thinking of, such as, collecting and maintaining publicly available quarterly progress reports. Well, it's not like they've got a progress report form over there.
For sure.
Probably have to need to spell out, what is it we want to see in this progress report?
And this points to another good option that you can take here, depending on committee time available. So you guys have a huge task ahead of you this session. So another piece of this is, you'll recall that when we talked about the rulemaking authority in that subdivision 2, and we talked about bringing in the policy intent section, that specific rulemaking section called out particular pieces that the agency needed to do. So the prioritization, and then also the bonus and incentive criteria. You could also include other language to say, agency, in your rulemaking, you need to fill out this, this, and this. And so the committee could take the approach of, we really want to dive into these particular details, enhance statutory language on these pieces, or you could say, we feel comfortable tasking the agency with building out particular pieces. And I think it can be helpful in that context to think about, one, you'll obviously have to think about time scarcity, but 2, if you think about where you guys as legislators can have the most impact, and I'm going to talk about some of these pieces when they get there later, because I think putting in statute things that you can have the most impact on in ways in which you want to shape the vision of education in the state is a nice thing to do. And when other pieces are more appropriately borne by a party that has technical expertise in a subject, it's nice to put that in the rulemaking bucket. So it's one way you could increase clarity or build out particular provisions, is to say, we think that this is something that the agency could handle on its own. So we're going to make clear that we task them with this piece. Top of page 4, 11th, developing a formal enrollment projection model or using projection models already available. I recall working group discussions to call out that this, it may be that enrollment projection models already exist, so this may be sort of an unnecessary responsibility. But the idea is that because this is meant to be a comprehensive vision, and particularly given the concerns around what's happening with the 5-district model, knowing what's happening, if there's declining enrollments in particular areas, could be helpful for informing, incentivizing consolidation or using buildings more appropriately. 12th, encouraging school districts and supervisory unions to investigate opportunities for the maximum utilization of space in and around the district. So we've had some provisions that are about sort of economic efficiency. That's how I think about having a pre-qualified list of contractors and the like. This is a sort of spatial efficiency type provision, making sure that people are using their space as best they can. Another functional piece, 13th, collecting and maintaining a clearinghouse of prototype school plans that may be consulted by eligible applicants. This will depend too on the kind of construction or renovation that you anticipate happening. If what happens with the school construction program is that it's largely a renovation type program, meaning that you're working with existing schools and not constructing something new, prototypes may not be so useful, right? That's going to have to be site specific. If, however, the project is contemplated to create new schools or replace old schools with modern facilities, you could start gaining economies of scale by using prototype type plans. So I think this in part hinges on whether the kind of approach that's envisioned in the program. Retaining the services of consultants to effectuate the roles and responsibilities listed within this section. So this could be, if the agency needs additional help in the construction space, they could call on folks with expertise in that area. And then 15th, annually reporting on or before December 15th to you guys, to the legislature as a whole, regarding the status and implementation of the program, including any data required to be collected. So ensuring an annual check-in on this program as it's implemented and developed. So that's setting up the program and listing a large set of responsibilities for the Agency of Education. There is a new body added in this proposed bill. So under section 3443, State Aid for School Construction Advisory Board. And I will stress that this was something that the group spent a lot of time thinking about, the extent of powers that this board should have. And the group landed on having an advisory board. So they don't have rulemaking power. They don't have the authority to call off decision-making essentially made by the Agency of Education. They aren't serving as a total gatekeeper in this space, but they would advise and serve as a sort of public-facing body to ensure essentially that the Agency of Education isn't just out on its own operating this program. So standing up a State Aid for School Construction Advisory Board, which would advise the agency on the implementation of the program in accordance with the provisions of this chapter, including adoption of rules, setting up statewide priorities, criteria for project approval, and recommendations for project approval and prioritization.
Can I jump in for a minute and just provide?
Yes.
to help me
Yeah, either
bring
of you, if you
Taylor
wanna
a
jump in.
little context from the working group. I think we struggled here initially coming in with a lot of ideas from the Rhode Island program and liking I don't remember exactly the name of their group is that helps sort of advise and really seems to have a role in that like bonus incentive arena of where the actual big decisions get made, who gets the money. So that construct was really appealing. And then as we went back in and understood more about sort of what did exist, there was a whole state board process that did exist. Got a little testimony from the state board that has not been something on there. Well, we haven't had state aid for a long time, has not been in their work plan. I think this speaks to the other big challenge we're all hearing and dealing with, which is sort of who does what, agency and state board of education. We had this sort of reversal, we changed our whole setup, and we heard from former Secretary Armando Villaseca on Friday in 2008, 2012. And these things have never perhaps been entirely figured out of sort of who's doing what and like what is the state board's role when there is an agency of education. This is obviously becoming a bigger and bigger issue as we think about potentially changing anything or everything about education. And so we ran into, we liked that they had this other body in Rhode Island, but the state board could do it, but the state board is sort of already buried in so many other rules. And when they came in, it didn't feel as much like it would be something they would be useful in doing, but we weren't comfortable with just saying, put it all in AOE. You know, this will probably be a small office of facilities, a facilities office at AOE, hopefully. So really kind of like some of these bigger governance things we're all struggling with. And this is you know, sort of a prime example of that. So do we need to change and resource the state board differently somehow? Are we creating something else to do it? Is the work that this group's doing slightly different? I think that was the other thing. It felt like this is, you know, you really need a sort of statewide lens, and you need the borrowing and sort of debt capacity lens that something like the bond bank and treasurer lens that's different than maybe the state board. So that's a long way of saying we're got pretty stuck on this, but did not want to create just an advisory council that was sort of unnecessary or duplicative.
I'm not really sure if we actually landed on that.
Right. So I think this is a really,
This is gonna take probably much more discussion.
yes, and I think it, as I'm feeling just in the last week, the discussion about state board and the AOE in general, the state board meeting yesterday, I think things we're going to get tested again this week. It's going to just continue to highlight this challenge of some very unresolved things about our system. And if we're hopefully going to invest in this part of it, going to have to resolve it here as well as in the bigger.
And one thing we'll come to in the next section, but just to call out before we get there, given your comments, this is a time-limited board. So there's a prospective repeal built into this draft, and the idea was that this is meant to help develop and implement the program, get it on its feet essentially, but that at some point it would drop away, and that hopefully it would be sort of not self-running, because there would still be annual check-ins and the like, but a functional kind of accepted body that's running this program. Board to be composed of 8 members. We don't have to talk so much about the technicalities of this. I would just point out what I pointed out in the working group. Having an even number of members can create uncomfortable circumstances. 4 ex officio members: state treasurer, commissioner of BGS, executive director of the Vermont Bond Bank, and the chair of the State Board of Education, or SBE. To talk about why the executive director of the Vermont Bond Bank is included on this piece, the vision that is built into this draft, but that isn't built out in a lot of detail, is switching off of that state bonding to support these programs that rely on the general obligation bonding of the state and can affect the state's debt capacity or bonding capacity, and moving to a structure where essentially municipalities would go through the Vermont Bond Bank. So they would have this backing of the Vermont Bond Bank to actually support the program, and then this program would run the state providing, didn't identify a revenue source, but there would be a special fund built out into which funds funnel, and those would be used to provide a debt service subsidy to the municipalities who have taken out loans through the Vermont Bond Bank. And this was crafted as a way of protecting, preserving the state's bonding capacity and ensuring that they aren't affecting that credit rating, which would increase the costs of all loans that the state takes out in the future if you affected that bonding capacity too much. So that's why the executive director of the Vermont Bond Bank is proposed to be included. Someone who would be wholeheartedly, firmly part of this program, the group that municipalities would be going through to initiate their projects. 4 members, none of whom would be legislative, to serve 4-year terms, and those would be 2 appointed by the speaker and 2 appointed by the committee on committees, each with expertise in education, construction, real estate, or finance, and one of whom shall represent a supervisory union in the case of that appointed by the House, one of whom to be an educator as appointed by the Senate. I know that there was some discussion in the committee about this supervisory union piece, having a representative from a supervisory union, because you could imagine them having a pretty vested interest in what's happening with the program. But this is, I would say, sometimes I walk into a room and I say that the committee composition that's been proposed is entirely placeholders. I would say that this reflects some deliberation as to what was happening here. There was some talk about the language, but I don't know if it represented a firm, you got to go this way. I'm gonna skip the next technicalities unless you guys really want to go into how staggered terms and the like work, but I don't expect you to. Duties. So we're at the bottom of page 6. The board's advising the agency on the implementation of the program in accordance with the provisions of this chapter, including, and I'll just call out basically the list of duties that you see here are to capture and supplement those sets of responsibilities that were set up in the section we just walked through, describing what the agency of education is tasked with doing. I will try to call out when particular pieces are not part of that list. Let me make sure I'm looking at my notes here. And I will say that in particular, I think the ordering of the responsibilities here matters. But broadly, it's worth saying you could, this is just including language. This board is meant to advise on the implementation of the program. They can do that in many ways. These are just particular tasks that are called out as being of importance. And I think that the first 3 of these are particularly important pieces. So rule making. So this is, there had at one point been a proposal within the working group to actually have a gatekeeping function for this board, where essentially the board would have to approve any rules. So basically the agency would submit rules to this board. The board would then okay it, and only then would the agency proceed to go through the formal rulemaking process. The working group backed away from that concept. I've not really seen that elsewhere. It's possible that it exists. But ended up with this concept where the board would advise on the rulemaking that the agency is meant to undertake. Project priorities, and this would be something that's done through rulemaking, which is calling out in particular, this is a nice space for input on the policy lever that drive the vision behind this program. And third, proposed legislation that the board deems desirable or necessary related to the program, the provisions of this chapter and any related laws. This is not an independent responsibility that the Agency of Education has. There is some language tasking the agency with developing policies and the like, but I would call this a unique provision of this board's duties is to come up with legislation that might enhance or fix problems that you guys are seeing in that annual check-in, or that the board itself is independently seeing.
Do we need to just be aware of language that would, basically want to require that the AOB confer with the advisory board?
Yes, and I would say it would affect even the title of the piece. Like we were switching the name of this up until the point that it was decided that it was purely advisory. If you're calling this out as an advisory board, it's meant exclusively to be advisory. So as soon as you start saying you have these specific checking functions, or you have actual decision-making power in this space beyond just providing guidance, and you can provide powerful guidance. It's not to say that you can't have a meaningful role as an advisor, but as soon as you opt away from that purely advisory role, I think the board's nature is changed entirely.
Could you explain, you said that, and you could have powerful guidance. What is the difference between guidance and powerful guidance?
I guess I think about in this particular case, we think about, so 1 and 2, rules pertaining to school construction and capital outlay, and then 2, project priorities. These are tasks the Agency of Education, at least as envisioned under this language, could be undertaking under the statute as written. So it could be, I'm not saying that it will be, but it could be that the agency is basically coming to the board and saying, can you just sign off on these things that we've decided in the rulemaking space? I would call out this third piece, proposed legislation, as a particular unique task that's been assigned as an advisory role, as being, it doesn't have to be more powerful, but because it is uniquely assigned to the board, I think of that as distinctive. That's the board coming to the agency and saying, these pieces would be useful here. So some of it can just be the flow of information. Are people checking in? Are they coming to others? And there's ways you could spell that out too. If you would like to ensure that the board is sort of the one driving rulemaking, there are likely ways to orient that or make it clearer that that would be the case. Because I would just say that under the language as written, it could be as simple as the agency coming to the board with their proposed rules, asking for a quick check, and then it being approved, in which case I would call that relatively limited advisory power. It's something, but it's, yeah.
Great. That's helpful.
Developing or advising on the development of policies and procedures designed to reduce borrowing. This is already an existing obligation for the agency, so this would just be advising on that piece. Formal enrollment projection model, same thing there. We saw that the Agency of Education is tasked with this responsibility, so just advising on this piece. Sixth, processes and procedures necessary to apply for, receive, administer, and comply with the conditions and requirements of any grant, gift, appropriation of property, services, or monies. This is uniquely assigned to the board. I will say that I don't recall a lot of discussion around these particular pieces, but just wanted to note that this is one that is not duplicative of the set of responsibilities that we discussed earlier, that the agency was tasked with. Seventh, those prototypical school plans. Eighth, the determination of eligible cost components of projects for funding or reimbursement, including partial or full eligibility for project components for which the benefit is shared between the school and other municipal and community entities. Again, this is one that's not duplicative of the responsibilities that are listed for the agency. And I would just call out that as a functional matter, this piece is quite important, because when we think about aid under the existing program and under the proposed program, aid is not available for the total cost of a project. It's only made available for the eligible components of that project. So determining what parameters actually spell out that eligibility is going to have a dramatic effect on the amount of state funding that's going out, and also the kinds of projects that might be facilitated. And I would call out that developing or encouraging the particular development, if it's through rulemaking by the agency, of eligibility conditions or the eligible cost components is another big policy lever that you can think about. And just since I'm talking about it here, I think nice policy levers to think about are this basic eligibility component, which is about eligible components of a project. It's also nice to think about eligibility conditions for getting in the door. What do projects need to meet to even get on a list for funds to come to them? And then bonus incentives are another huge policy lever to think about. And just to explain the concept there, we've talked about a debt service subsidy model that's going to provide a particular percentage of aid to municipalities that have bonded through the Vermont Bond Bank to support their school construction projects. That provides a base funding amount, but you could elect to provide, and the current draft contemplates providing additional aid above and beyond that particular kinds of projects. And that would be done through what we call bonus incentives. So that would supply basically increments of additional percentage aid based on that project meeting particular conditions. And this is a huge way to encourage particular kinds of projects, because you can say we're giving extra dollars to projects that accomplish A, B, and C. Eighth, the determination of eligible cost. Sorry, this is what I just walked through. Ninth, this is another big one too. Development of a long-term vision for a statewide capital plan in accordance with needs and projected funding. This is not duplicative of an existing agency responsibility under the language that we just walked through. And this strikes me as a place that could have a pretty significant effect on the scope of the program. Long-term vision for statewide capital plan. 10th, collecting and maintaining data on all public school facilities in the state, including information on size, usage, enrollment, availability, available facility space, and maintenance. I would call out that this is slightly different from a capital needs assessment or a facilities assessment, which is talking about dollars in the state of your actual physical infrastructure. This is talking about data on schools broadly. What is their enrollment? How are things going within their programs? It's not just facility focus. And I would think about this in the way that you can think of, maybe it's helpful to back up a little bit here. The current state of the school construction program, which has priorities assigned to emergency projects, I think of, just looking at the language, and admittedly, I don't have the institutional history that you guys will have, as addressing physical decay and dealing with sort of last minute fixes. And particularly if you think about the fact that it's emergency aid that has persisted through the moratorium, that program doesn't express a particular educational vision. There have been times when it did, when you think about trying to introduce energy saving programs by providing large amounts of aid to particular kinds of projects. But as currently run, it doesn't express, I would say, a particular educational vision other than remedying, and maybe this is a response to the current state financial conditions, other than remedying emergency situations. I think of this 10th piece about getting broader data beyond just school facilities, like are things in decay, is getting at how educational vision can inform a school construction program, because you want to know what schools are doing to know how to approach them, even from a facilities standard. And if-
But my question with 10 would be, this is an advisory committee that doesn't really have a structure or
Sure.
staff, and you're asking them to collect and maintain data.
So call out, they would be advising the agency on doing these
Yeah.
pieces, so helping them to build this out. And I think you draw a very good point in the technicalities of this board. It's also time limited, obviously, even beyond the staffing for this, in how many meetings they're gonna hold. And this is also part of what led the group, I think, to back away from some of the gatekeeping functions, because you can imagine if you said this is the first actor at looking at agency proposed rules, but they only meet 6 times a year, you could end up with this massive backlog of duties that need to be carried out. So, yep, but that's a good point, just to draw back. This is still, it is an advisory board. They would not be the independent body doing this. They would be telling the agency how to handle these particular pieces. And hopefully that information can be used to facilitate whatever vision is built out, both in statute through you guys and through rulemaking by the agency. On page 8, advising districts on the use of a needs survey. So this ties into that existing quinquennial capital needs assessment. And 12th, encouraging school districts, supervisory unions to investigate opportunities for spatial maximization. So again, duplicative of that already existing agency responsibility. I'm going to skip over the meetings, except to call out that this does have the first meeting of the board occurring in August 15th, 2025. In looking at this before we walked in here, I just need to make sure whenever we go through all these pieces and resolved how things stand, to make sure that the effective dates account for each of these moving parts. Currently, this isn't effective till 2026, so they couldn't meet in August 15th, 2025. But just to ensure that we check in on these functions and these technical provisions as we move forward. Section 4, this is what I was discussing earlier. This is a time-limited advisory board, so to be repealed July 1st, 2035. So the idea is 10-year program, get us started. Section 5 is the school construction aid special fund. So creation and designation of money for particular purposes. So as you may know, within a special fund, you have to specify the particular uses, all that those funds can be used for. So these 4 pieces were talked about with some, I would say, some extensive deliberation within the working group. So awarding aid to school construction projects, but also awarding grants through the facilities master plan grant program. I'm going to return to this piece when we get to the actual approval process, because it will be made clearer why you would this to be a guaranteed funding part. 3rd, funding administrative costs, and 4th, awarding emergency aid. So the special fund would be available for that basic aid you're envisioning under the program, grants for master planning, administrative costs of the program, and emergency aid. And just to call it again, we have placeholder funds language consist of any amounts transferred appropriated by the General Assembly and any interest earned. You can stick with this, but I would say the working group did not address, and I think smartly did not address, what the actual revenue source would be, particularly given everything else that's going on in the ed fund space. There are just too many moving parts for the working group to take a stance on how this would work out. So now we come to the actual meat of this. This is section 6, 16 VSA section 3445. I will call out this. So this is the approval and funding process for projects. This is going to look very similar to what is on the books as Title 16, Section 3448, and contemplates similarly a 2-step application process. So first, top of page 10, preliminary application for construction aid. Eligible school districts that intend to avail themselves of state aid will submit a written preliminary application to the secretary, and it will include information that's required by the agency by rule. That's something the agency would build out. I will call out that we have on the books the state board's 6000 series. That set of rules, which was built out to address the current school construction program, already exists. And there's language included in the bill, and we'll come to at the very end, that transfers that set of rules to the Agency of Education to ensure that there's no gap of continuity. But of course, the agency would be free to modify its rules, to change its process, to repeal particular pieces. But that's a nice way of ensuring that you don't start with nothing, that you're not at this 3 years behind because rules aren't being. So The secretary, when considering this application under subdivision 2, has to consider particular things, and it's important to call out, this is just considerations. These are not your eligibility conditions. That are just things that the secretary needs to look to when considering a preliminary application for school construction aid. So regional educational opportunities and needs, including building capacities across district boundaries, available infrastructure in neighboring communities. You can see some of the flavor of moving toward more consolidated or dealing with thinking regionally is maybe a way to think about this. Economic efficiencies, the suitability of an existing school building to continue to meet educational needs, and statewide educational initiatives. I should call out that these are largely built into existing statutes, so these are not new things that the group was suggesting today. We've decided these are to be considered about. I do think there was and we have reps to speak to this, agreement that these were thoughtful things to include. So it's not as if they haven't been looked over. I just want to call out that these weren't direct responses to current conditions that were independently developed by the working group. But those are your secretary considerations. So just pieces to think about. Starting on line 18, we now have the actual eligibility conditions. And I would just remind you, this is a nice place to think about policy levers. It's a place where you can have a real effect on the funnel that lets particular projects get to state dollars. So first, the project or part of the project fulfills a need occasioned by, and then we have 4 different conditions that that project can meet. So conditions that threaten the health or safety of students or employees, facilities inadequate to provide programs required by law or regulation, excessive energy use, or deterioration of an existing building. These are all already on the books. These are the recognized needs for the existing program, but there is a new piece here, including on line 8. So this particular first condition is you can meet, to get through this process, one of those 4 needs: condition threatening health or safety, inadequate programs, excessive energy use, deterioration, or if the project results in consolidation of 2 or more school buildings and will serve the educational needs of students in a more cost-effective and educationally appropriate manner as compared to projects constructed separately. Program that does that, that's consolidating in this particular way, that's meeting these particular requirements, wouldn't need otherwise to fulfill one of those 4 listed needs. It would still need to meet the remaining eligibility conditions in this section. So this isn't saying consolidation projects, you're through the door. There's a bunch of other conditions you have to meet. But it is saying, and the reason that this particular language was included is school districts could voluntarily, that is, in the absence of these kinds of problems, so they don't have threats to health or safety, they don't have a deterioration of existing building, they aren't excessively using energy, look around regionally and say, we think that this is the best practice to consolidate, and I want to ensure that the fact that they aren't failing in those needs-based ways excludes them from state aid. So this is a way of ensuring that those that are taking a consolidation approach could get state aid. But it's not to say that you have to do that to get state aid. If you meet one of those need fulfillments above, you don't have to go through this subdivision 2 on line A. So that's your first eligibility condition: meet one of the needs fulfillments or do this consolidation approach. But there are other eligibility conditions as well. So the need addressed by the project cannot reasonably be met by another means. This is just ensuring that it's narrowly tailored, that you are doing this because other options aren't out there. You don't have simple ways of fixing this problem. And that's also currently on the books. 3, the proposed type, kind, quality, size, and estimated cost of the project are suitable for the proposed curriculum and meet all legal standards. Again, this is one that's on the books. This is just ensuring, again, kind of a narrow tailoring type approach, that you're being thoughtful in constructing that project, that you're not going beyond the bounds of what's necessary to remedy the problem, and that you're meeting particular standards. But next, we do come to 2 new proposed eligibility conditions that the working group came up with. So first, that the applicant achieves the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards regarding facilities management adopted by rule by the agency. So this is a standard that the Agency of Education already has. And this is saying that you need to become proficient in those school district quality standards to meet eligibility conditions and therefore have access to school construction aid, state aid for your projects. The last eligibility condition, the applicant has completed a facilities master planning process. And this is again why, to call back to that fund, that's why master planning was listed as one of the eligible uses of the special fund, because it's now included or proposed to be included as an actual eligibility condition. The applicant has completed this master planning process. That engages robust community involvement, considers regional solutions, evaluates environmental contaminants, and produces a facilities master plan that unites that vision statement, educational needs, enrollment projections, renovation needs, and construction projects. I would qualify here that this is a process requirement. This is saying you need to have gone through that master planning process that involves all of these conditions and produces a master plan. It doesn't mean that you're qualified. It's just saying you need to have gone through that process to ensure that you're uniting and thinking about vision statement, educational needs, enrollment projections, renovation needs, and the like. But it is a process requirement nonetheless. So those are your 5 eligibility conditions. That's meeting one of the needs-based conditions or taking the consolidation approach. You can't reasonably meet it otherwise. There's a fit to the project, achieve the level of proficiency in school district quality standards, and you've completed the facilities master planning process. Third, we come to priorities. So we're on page 12, line 7.
I'm gonna interrupt for just a quick
Yes.
second. It was Act 153 of sometime in the 2010s that also had an incentive to consolidate. I don't know if you had looked at any of the language from back then.
I'm not, yeah. I'll have to do my history.
Yeah. Might be worth just taking a look at to see
Sure.
if there's something that we didn't think of.
Thank you. Priorities. So again, I'll just flag, this is another big policy lever. So we just talked about eligibility conditions as a big policy lever. You can have a real effect on the funnel. Now we're talking about when dollars are made available to projects. And just to back up as to the way that this works, schools would go out and bond, support the school construction projects that they are intending to pursue. And presumably they need state aid to pursue these projects. Otherwise, we might expect that there have been many more school construction projects over the intervening years since the moratorium was started. They then would go on a list, and this would be presented to the legislature through that budgetary request that the agency is making through the governor. And dollars would be made available in order, basically, on that priority list. So you could be on that list for some time. That's the concept that's addressed here. So the reason I call out the prioritization as a big policy levers, this affects how quickly people are going to actually be able to have access to that state aid. So just a big piece here, and I would call it, the way that it's set up here is that after approval of the preliminary application and provided that the district has voted those funds, the agency, with the advice of the board, that new advisory board, assigns points to the project so that it can be placed on priority list. But I would just flag for you guys, those prioritization points are intended to be built out currently in rulemaking. If the group would like to have a say in how prioritization works, you can build out in statute particular priorities. In fact, that's the way that the current program works. It's admittedly fairly limited and it focuses on emergency needs, but you could codify the particular prioritization that you want, or if you felt that there wasn't sufficient time to get to those pieces, it's something where you could provide additional detail to the agency in carrying out its rulemaking on this piece. Currently, the agency is called out as being tasked with rulemaking on prioritization points, but you could make that even more detailed and say prioritization points that favor this vision. And that's where the pulling in the policy statement can have such a big effect, because it can inform how the agency develops those prioritization points to align with that policy statement.
So I need to review a very basic thing I think you said was that a district would vote on a bond before it would know its potential share of state aid.
That's right.
Okay, this is more for my colleagues on my right and left, that the committee discussed, wouldn't a district want to know when it might be getting state aid before it puts bond out there? Yeah.
So there may be a way in which I can be helpful to this piece if presumably the bonus incentives would be built out in rule and that base share would be set in statute. They would have a sense for the kinds of dollars they could expect to receive, but as to when they would receive them, they may not know. That's more a timing gap. And it would be dependent, of course, because it's a list of priorities on what other districts around the state are pursuing. And this is something where you could maybe envision, and I don't recall us talking about this, But this may be a place where the technical assistance from the agency is particularly helpful to school districts in understanding what's happening around the state. So they can have a sense to, oh, okay, I'm only going to hit 60 points if I pursue this particular kind of project. So I can't expect to receive state aid for maybe years before I receive state aid. So that could affect the kind of project that they elect to do.
Oh, that's very helpful perspective. Thank you. Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense.
But again, also calls out why thinking about whether you'd like to codify, put this in statute, or whether you'd like for this to be in rulemaking is a big decision. Fourth, we've already talked about this piece, but the request for legislative appropriation, agency would submit its annual school construction funding request to the governor as part of the budget. And following submission of the governor's recommended budget to the legislature as a whole, committees of jurisdiction, so House Education, you guys, and the Senate Committee on Education would recommend a total school construction appropriation for the next fiscal year. And again, that would be accounted for in the Gov recommended budget. So it wouldn't be some separate monetary ask that the committees of jurisdiction are making part of that proposal. And there was some discussion as to where which committee should be handling this particular piece. There had been a point where it was talked about in a way sort of amorphously, just the legislature as a whole thinking about this, with the idea that inevitably committees would be interested in this piece and might take it up, but ultimately landed on committees on education, in contrast to the current program, which is funneled through the capital bill process and therefore gone through corrections and institutions and the institution committee. Senate.
Again, this may be a question better for these two, but there must have been some discussion about whether making it an annual appropriation in the governor's budget versus a dedicated revenue source with a special fund to sort of protect it from that. There was a reason.
I think we were learning a lot about budgeting and the way the state budget works through this process, and a lot of help from Chris Ruby at JFO that gave us a more sophisticated understanding. And so I think that is maybe a point of clarification. I'm not, a special fund, how does a special fund interact with the governor's recommend? It's a policy piece that I don't think I could explain or know off the top of my head. Like, I don't know if it's just automatic within the fund, if there's still, we could take after schools or cannabis fund, something like that as an example to walk through, but I think we need to understand the mechanics. Help me, maybe I'm missing.
No, and I think we talked about a dedicated fund, a dedicated revenue fund. There's possibility of fluctuation.
Yeah.
In that, and we did want to take into account the fluctuation on the curve, something like that.
But even mechanically, I'm not sure exactly how those two.
All right, we'll flag that for further discussion then.
I think both statements accurate. Rep. Taylor's recollection of what JFO relayed is certainly accurate, pointing out some of the downsides of having a dedicated revenue stream, just in both volatility and the way that it siphons off from other priorities. But it may be helpful to have Chris speak to that piece if you want to go further down that road. And just to call out the way that the special fund is currently set up, you could alter that. There's nothing about it that's special as to the way that money is flowing into it. It's currently set up as just sets of appropriations that the General Assembly makes, but you could have a dedicated revenue stream flow into that. You would just want to think about practicalities.
I think of childcare. Okay, we have a dedicated revenue stream, a special fund. It's sort of, we know that there's going to be money in it every year. It's not really subject to the political whims of the legislature or the governor. Although that is.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly. Others might.
That may not be a true statement.
How special funds interact
All right, great.
with the governor's budgeting process.
You could definitely integrate. There's no necessary issue. It's more of just the high level question of finding dollars.
And I do think, you look at Massachusetts, they do have a more dedicated revenue stream, a special fund, whereas Rhode Island, I assume, is strictly a budget request each year.
If you guys want to do a sort of Rhode Island focus at some point, I would certainly be interested in being in here for that, or if you would like for me to prepare things to talk about distinctive elements. But I know that in the past, folks from Rhode Island have come in and spoken at
We've
length
got,
about it.
we've got a number of videos
Yep.
we can just watch
Yep.
on that.
Okay. Even better. For my workbook, that sounds great. Final approval, so talked about this as a two-step application process. First, the preliminary application, which has both that consideration check by the secretary, making particular considerations, and then an eligibility check. Second, there's a final approval, and so this is calling out that unless approved by the secretary for good cause in advance of commencement of construction, a school district shall not begin construction before secretary approves the final application. May submit that application at any time following approval of the preliminary application, but just to call out, to even get on the priority list, you would need to have voted funds. So in some ways, you need to do both to even think about how you're going to move forward. The secretary may approve a final application for a project provided that the project has received preliminary approval and voted funds are authorized to bond for the total estimated cost of the project. So just to call out, those are the two pieces that make available getting on that priority list. So by necessity, you've got on the priority list. You will already meet these two conditions of the final approval. And then the next pieces are kind of functional check-ins. Has the district made arrangements for project construction supervision? Provided for construction financing during a period prescribed by the agency? Otherwise met the requirements of the chapter. And this last piece, which is a holdover, it's actually not the last piece. We have another condition on the next page, but this piece about playgrounds is a holdover from the existing language. This is not something that we talked about. I think we've just included this to ensure compliance with existing federal laws. And then lastly, if the total estimated cost of the proposed project is less than $50,000, no performance bond or revocable letter of credit shall be required. So meeting all of these conditions for final approval, and just to call out, we haven't seen anything to say that a performance bond or revocable letter of credit is required in the first place. This is actually something that's built out in State Board of Education rule. So some things are already in rule, some things on the statute. It makes it sort of hard to navigate this space because we don't always know what the full extent of regulations are, but that's where that piece is coming on. And it's just calling out that if you have a relatively low value project, you don't need the same kind of financial guarantees in place.
So let me ask you about that low value project or a project that does this only govern projects that would want a bonus incentive?
This only
or
governs
base funding. So in other words,
exactly.
I think if Colchester just passed a bond, it's getting no aid, can a school district still?
Absolutely. So this chapter is for districts that want to avail themselves of state aid. If a school district doesn't want to do that, they can continue to bond on their own. They can proceed as is currently happening in under the current moratorium. And of course, the effect on that is, at least under our current education finance system, there are statewide impacts to that because it flows through the education spending and raises tax rates across the state, and in particular in that district. But that's definitely is something to think about, and obviously in conjunction with the broader education transformation overhaul, I think that's something to keep mind of is like, is there a way to do this that funnels school construction through a process where we know what kind of funds are becoming available and not creating sort of unpredictable impact on the state as a whole? But that may be too much of an ask. I mean, there's just so many moving parts at this point.
I think that's where the hope of some sort of advisory council, some sort of whatever this other body of expertise entity is that is. And obviously there's so many moving parts that one impacts the other here, foundation formula versus the way we do state funding for education now would change this dramatically, but whether it's, JFO expertise, tax expertise, but understanding and being able to sort of see the whole state and know, okay, if we do two big comprehensive high schools, where's that impact locally versus where is it statewide? How is that? Being able to kind of move those pieces with some coordination. And I think that's where we were stuck kind of on how to construct that.
Although wouldn't the advisory group sort of be the ones to have that bigger chess piece vision?
Potentially, I'm not sure that as it's in here is very much a placeholder. It's set up the right way to do that. But I think that there was a clear need or desire to do that if we are looking at perhaps a sort of period of robust school construction, having come from a period of none and knowing where we are right now and the building costs keep rising and so that somebody, some entity, some group being able to do that well
Mhm.
is going to be really important.
Sort of, yeah, thinking if there's a way of ensuring that there is systematic thinking about construction across the state as a whole, rather than a bunch of actors acting independently of each other.
Yeah.
And then funds just kind of going willy-nilly.
Yeah.
It's all,
Keep
And
that at
considering-
top of mind.
And trying to parse out that, local versus statewide impact. Well, our whole finance system could potentially change. So there's just some really big.
right, and this could, depending on what happens with the overhaul, or depending, even if you don't do a full overhaul as proposed in the administration proposal, even other changes could affect the way that money flows in these spaces, right? School construction can be a separate stream from, and in many ways it is a separate stream from funding. It's just that currently it constitutes education spending. That's how you're affecting, that's how currently the siphoning that happens through the municipal bonding for school construction is affecting education finance as a whole. So, but you could set this up in a way to where they're essentially separate pieces and they don't have to implicate each other. The school construction could be different pool of money. It doesn't have to be the same.
And I'm gonna have you hold there. It looks like the rest of it's kind of
Sure.
just technical stuff.
Yep.
I just want to give the committee 5 minutes to stretch before we come back into play here at 2:30.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Sure.
you.
There's a lot here for us to go back. and read.
Yeah.